Hello and welcome to this on-demand session in relation to outsourcing. My name is Anne Mannering and I am a lawyer in the Financial Services Regulatory team at Latham & Watkins in London. And I'm delighted to welcome my panelists for this session today, Alithia Bernard-Stewart, Emily Henderson and Louise Roger. So starting off with introductions, Alithia is the EMEA Compliance COO at Argo, a role she has held for nearly a year. Her role involves compliance coordination and oversight of operational topics, including outsourcing. And prior to Wells Fargo, Liv worked in compliance roles for UBS and Barclays, and she'll be drawing from her experience on all of these roles in our discussion today. I'd also like to welcome to the panel Emily Henderson. Emily is an experienced compliance officer and solicitor. Emily specialises in private side compliance for corporate finance transactions, including public and private M&A, equity capital markets, corporate governance and financial regulation more generally. Prior to joining Rothschild & Co. as head of Group Central Compliance and UK Corporate Finance Compliance, Emily qualified as a corporate solicitor at Slaughter and she moved into compliance in Barclays Investment Banking Division in 2017. And I'd also like to welcome Louise Roger. Louise is a compliance director at AFME, and Louise works with AFME's compliance committee and leads several member working groups for AFME, including the working group in relation to outsourcing. And so our panelists today have a wealth of experience in relation to outsourcing, including from a practical implementation perspective. And therefore, in this session, we're going to focus on outsourcing in practice, including the implementation challenges that may be common to many member firms. And I wanted to kick off the session today by highlighting up to you a paper that has recently been published by AFME in conjunction with the law firms Latham & Watkins, Matheson and BSP. And the paper is entitled Outsourcing, Guidance on the Legal and Regulatory Framework. And the purpose of this paper has really been driven by the large amount of regulatory change that we have seen in the outsourcing space. And what it really aims to do is pull together all of the different outsourcing requirements from a European perspective into a single source as a helpful compliance tool for firms. And I just wanted to spend very quickly a few moments going through with you how the paper works. So it's split into three sections. The first section covers European level outsourcing specific guidance, in particular the EBA guidelines. The second part of the paper looks at other European measures which, whilst not outsourcing specific, contain outsourcing requirements. So a good example is MiFID II. The paper goes through the MiFID II requirements and pulls out the outsourcing specific pieces within those. And then finally, the third part of the paper looks at the jurisdictional specific overlay to each of the European considerations looked at in parts 1 and 2. And it does that for Italy, Germany, Spain, Luxembourg, Ireland, and the UK. And the idea for firms is that they can tab between those different sections based on the jurisdictions that are relevant for them. And therefore, the purpose of the paper is very much intended as a practical guide that firms can use not only for implementation, but also for their ongoing compliance with the legal and regulatory requirements in relation to outsourcing. And this is probably a good point if I bring in Louise. Louise, if you could perhaps talk us through the genesis of the paper and also why outsourcing has been such a key topic for AFME members over the last year or so.
Thank you, Anne. And in putting this together, AFME's Compliance Committee and AFME's Compliance Issues Working Group members were especially keen on bringing together all of the different European requirements for outsourcing arrangements into one place. There are lots of various sources of information, and it was certainly a request for the committee to consolidate that in one place so that it could act as a comprehensive and reliable navigational tool. Many of our members have been in discussions with the ECB and with other national regulators as they begin their Brexit planning and preparations. And inevitably, firms have need to make changes to their operating models, and outsourcing has been a key consideration in all of this. So you hopefully will see a copy of the report. You'll notice that sort of one of the key areas of focus in the report or reference tool was to map out all of the different outsourcing arrangements with group entities as well as third parties, and to understand a bit more about the relationship between branches and head offices in how firms approach and undertake outsourcing. So I think, taking a step back, the sort of key driver or objective was to produce this comprehensive and practical operational tool for use by colleagues at firms in legal, compliance, IT roles, and other areas across the business to give that holistic view of how it all works. This was a discussion that we started at last year's Compliance and Legal conference in Paris, and I think the paper builds on those discussions and delivers with a very practical operational tool with all of the consolidated information together in one place.
Thanks, Louise. And one of the points that you just made that I really wanted to pick up on was the fact that the paper isn't just intended solely for legal and compliance. Certainly from my experience, it's very useful to make sure that everyone within a firm that has a touch point within the outsourcing life cycle has a good understanding of the rules and essentially is singing from the same hymn sheet. Emily, perhaps this is a good moment to pass to you to see whether that has been your experience of the paper in practice.
Yes, thank you, Anne. So, as you kindly introduced me, I'm from Rothschild & Co. We have a number of different business lines, and we've grown quite significantly in a couple of those areas in the last few years. Our legal and compliance function, particularly at the group level, which is mostly based in London, has not yet expanded in capacity to maybe deal with things internally with the sort of same level of subject matter experts as the bigger banks, such as my old shop, Barclays. So I have found this paper really very useful on the practical side. For example, in the schedules and appendices to the document, there's a number of templates, and these are, I think, very business and business support focused. One of the templates in particular is just a document where you can fill in the details of a contract that is either an internal or an external outsourcing contract, and then you've got a straightforward record. You don't need to be a lawyer or a compliance person to fill that in. That could be your role in part of the IT procurement team. And it kind of standardizes things, which is really helpful for a firm with smaller support functions like us. I've also shared the paper with my legal and information security colleagues, because as with, I think, many of us, IT and cloud outsourcing is, an increasing concern in making sure we're getting the right SLAs built into contracts, and that we know how to manage the outsourcing risks there. And sometimes it can seem difficult knowing where to start. Whereas with this paper, although it's a fairly hefty thing overall, you can dip in, or I've been able to dip in and out of bits that are relevant to a particular question that's come up on, do we need to consider this in this jurisdiction? Is there a significant difference that we need to take account of between the UK and that other jurisdiction? And so I have found it a really practical tool. And it's also something that, as you say, can be shared more widely. It's not written in particularly kind of technical legalese. It's actually really understandable, even if part of what I am understanding from it is, right, I need to go and seek more advice on this area, because actually this is just, this is a summary here. but it's kind of helping with knowing the right questions to ask.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And I really would encourage people to look to the annexes to the paper. There are 5 annexes in there. And again, they are meant to be helpful, practical tools, even if you're not using them as the starting point, as a helpful checklist. So there is a template outsourcing register. There are 2 contractual checklists, one for the EBA guidelines and one for the cloud outsourcing requirements. There's also a checklist of the UK requirements. And then there's also a comparison between the MiFID II delegated regulation requirements and the EBA guidelines, which is again a helpful starting point to see where you might already have quite a bit of work that can be utilised for your EBA guidelines compliance. And I think that leads us neatly on to look at the EBA guidelines in a bit more detail. As I mentioned in the intro to this session, one of the key drivers around this paper and the AFME focus here has been the plethora of change that we've seen in relation to outsourcing. And for most member firms, I think the EBA guidelines will be the key implementation projects that they are dealing with. And so, Lith, I wanted to come to you to talk about some of your experiences around putting a project around this in practice, some of the practical implementation issues and considerations that you've seen on your work in this area.
Inter-entity sourcing and intra-group sourcing. And I think the EBA guidance has shone a light on that, even though it's not really new, but it really has shone a light on requirements to have equivalent controls around internal sourcing as we would for third-party sourcing. And I should say, actually, I've been working in and around outsourcing for about 10 years. This is the first role where I've directly been responsible for outsourcing as part of my role. But if I reflect back on the reasons and the different programs that I've worked on, which have related to outsourcing, I think we've had historically UK firms in particular operating under the CIS-Gate rules and historically more under the SEBS guidance. So I would think back my early days at Barclays when we were working through client money issues that we had and the reliance that we had on our custodian and administrator and what that means and what it means when your provider is also an authorised provider of financial services and a specialist firm. And then I think working through UK bank ring fencing, I should say, at Barclays also, and starting to think about how that legal entity restructure changes the way that services are provided between entities, and whether you can have even one, a couple of businesses that used to operate out of one legal entity still providing the same sort of services to one another when they're split across a number of entities. I would flip forward also to the PRA operational continuity and resolution rules, which triggered, again, moved on to a new firm, triggered the split out of corporate centre functions into a separate legal entity for continuity purposes. And so you sort of have, and then we have Brexit, and I think Brexit has really shone a light again on services and corporate centre services are provided between entities in this region. So I think, I'm not mentioning, Brexit in particular, not even mentioning cloud or operational continuity in particular, but I think it's just working our way through all of these different challenges and different sets of regulations in a way, actually bringing the enhanced EBA guidelines actually brings a lot of this together. And you've mentioned MiFID already, Anne. So at least we have now some equivalence in definitions, and we have some consistency across those rule sets, which I think is really handy. One thing I would just sort of mention, I worked previously for a Swiss bank, Anne has mentioned. So then, we had different centres in the US, we had different centres in UK, Switzerland, Europe. So I think managing around the different requirements between the Fed and the OCC, FINMA, and then ECB as well. So I think it's good to see harmonisation, but I do still think that there is some differences in the way that different regulators interpret, in particular, the inter-entity piece. I think is the last remaining piece I would like to see a little bit more consistency in from a global perspective. Certainly now working for a US bank, I feel that.
I think that's a really good point as well, to pick up a question that we received in advance of this session. So we received a question essentially around this point of differing interpretations, and in particular focusing around what is a material or a critical outsourcing and what is not. And the question raised was whether this is causing, or whether uncertainties are causing additional challenges and costs for firms. And I think from my perspective, it's certainly interesting from the UK side. We had the PRA consultation where they specifically call out this point that an assessment of what is a material outsourcing will often, whilst it is a firm responsibility, it will often result in inconsistent outcomes. And the PRA raises concerns about material outsourcings being reported to it late. But it does also, on the flip side, note that this is a consideration which is a firm level, individual entity level consideration, because it's inherently tied to that individual entity's ongoing compliance with the threshold conditions. So of course, each assessment will be individual. And I therefore was interested to see if there are any comments from the panel around whether the divergence there was creating issues, particularly in a wider group, or whether, as you say, actually where we are going is leading to further harmonisation, which is actually helpful.
If I may, I think that one of the issues is you need to look at it through the regulator's lens rather than through the internal lens. So something, if your outsourcing program is run at a group level, something that is critical or material at a group level, well, let me put it the other way around, something that's critical or important at a subsidiary or branch level within a region or within a jurisdiction may not also be something that's critical and important from a global perspective. So I think sometimes, certainly it's very important to make sure that you've got the correct local representation when you have a program that's being run globally. And I think also, and again, reflecting on being a relatively small entity within a much larger, very US-based group, I think also making sure that you have a seat at the table where decisions are being made about what, how definitions are being developed, what scenarios behind them is really important, so that we're making sure that we're meeting our regulators' expectations in this region, not just what the group has determined to be relevant.
I think it's interesting as well because, as you say, the PRA takes the bottom-up approach as well. So in the paper, they also raise the fact that they have concerns that third-party arrangements, which may not meet the definition of an outsourcing, nevertheless should still be subject to governance, monitoring, reporting, etc., because they also threaten the PRA's objectives, and of course they may feed into the operational resilience of the firms involved. So in some ways I think we see the narrowing of the field at an individual NCA level, and as you say, that needs to feed in. And Louise, again, is this something that AFME has also been looking at as well, particularly with the divergences in Europe?
I've not heard that it's necessarily causing an expense at this stage, but it's certainly creating uncertainty. And I think one of the focuses or purposes of the paper is to perhaps socialise and bring attention to this with the regulators, and try and sort of bring everyone together and create greater harmonisation. So that's certainly a forward look objective of the work that we're doing here.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about the AFME outsourcing paper is that it highlights that there is still divergence in this area at a European level. whilst we do have the overall framework, the jurisdictional sections are, show there are a lot of nuances, there are regulator-specific considerations, and of course that always generates issues for firms in terms of their compliance. And Emily, I'm not sure if that's something that you might have experienced, and whether there's sort of levelling up considerations, or whether that's something that you can talk to from your experience.
Yes, very much. So we're quite interesting here in that we have most of our group functions, and our largest business area is London, UK. But because Rothschild & Co is listed in France, the ACPR is our lead regulator for, a significant number of areas. So there is that kind of constant tension between the FCA's expectations versus ACPR or other. I mean, not just France, of course, we are regulated by other regulators around the world. But I think particularly between the English law and regulatory and civil regulatory regimes, there can be quite a bit of cultural and market practice divergence, as well as strict letter of the law divergence, and managing that from a group level can be a bit challenging sometimes across many areas. And I would say, again, going back to this being a very practical, the paper that AFME and Latham and Watkins put together, being a very practical kind of guidance manual. One of the things I've found very useful is being able to have a quick sense check of whether pushback or questions and concerns around things that we're trying to implement out of the UK or by group, wherever that bit of the group is based, is really arising from differences in law, differences in interpretation at a local level of that law, or just differences in attitude and approach, including to how much we tell our regulators. Late notifications of material outsourcing, I think, or critical outsourcing, is something that does come up here, or rather, hopefully not late notifications themselves, but discussion of when the right time to notify, whether we need to at all, does come up quite a lot here because of that difference in expectation, both of our local compliance and business individuals, as well as the regulators. And I think with SMCR, so we're a core firm, we're solo regulated in the UK, we're not regulated by the PRA, so we've only just very recently come into the SMCR regime, and I think that's added an extra overlay of maybe of caution in the UK that we need to very carefully explain to colleagues elsewhere, to make sure actually we've got some internal consistency and coherence, as well as dealing with regulators in an appropriate manner. Because of course, in a firm, including one that's still relatively small compared to some of the big banks, like where I've worked before, where Lith works, we do want that internal coherence and consistency where possible as well. And I think being able to just very quickly skim through the paper and crib up on what I'm hearing from Germany or Luxembourg is actually kind of consistent with what this paper says, or maybe whether I should be challenging or asking more questions, has been really helpful. Everyone has their internal political areas, of course, that are always a bit sensitive. But just knowing the right questions to ask internally, so that people don't brush this off as, oh, this is just an intergroup thing, or that's just a UK thing, is really valuable for me.
Yeah. And Liz, is that something you experienced sort of on the US side as well?
Yes, it is. I find actually though that to be fair to my US colleagues, I think that they're actually quite interested in the position over here. So a very live example, I had a query around whether something is material and whether it's notifiable just in the last couple of weeks. But the question really pins on the fact that it's in the cloud, and myself and a couple of colleagues have had a read through, and they had actually sought out the FCA papers, and they had actually sought out the EBA guidance, but it's just what is the local view and what is the local interpretation on this, and this is a communication mechanism, so it really depends on what we're using the communication mechanism for, rather than the fact that it's cloud. So working through some of those questions with them. To Emily's point on even differences in interpretation within Europe. So where does if I think back to my previous firm, where does our German interpretation of how the outsourcing rules are being applied come from? Does it come from conversations you've had with the BaFin? Does it come from special audits, or is it in fact coming from a consulting firm rather than actually from the regulator? And therefore, could we speak to the ECB and the BaFin about what they think of our interpretation, the way that we're running our inventories, the way that we're taking our materiality questions? And I think often you can come to actually quite a pragmatic point of view when you actually start those conversations and get the right groups of people involved, I think, because sometimes the way that it's been done is because that's the way that it's always been done, that's the way that we've done it for several years, rather than that's actually what the rules require us to do.
Yeah, and I think you've both mentioned as well the sort of additional overlay that Brexit is going to bring to this. I think it's just another layer on top of the considerations we've already talked through. And that's not just as a result of the loss of passporting rights that we will see when the transition ends at the end of this year, but also because of the UK's onshoring exercise and the changes that we're going to see to UK law and the UK regulators' approach as well. And therefore, this is something that we picked up in the paper, and there were quite a few discussions about. And again, the paper worked through each of the different requirements and looks at what the Brexit changes will be. But of course, one of the key focus areas in the working group and the discussions for this paper were in relation to the impact of UK branches of EEA firms. And Louise, I know this was something that there was a particular push for the paper to cover. I was wondering if you could talk us through some of the discussions and considerations that firms had in that area.
Certainly, Anne, I'd be very happy to. So in terms of a driver for the paper, Brexit was a very key consideration. And this was a sort of focus for EEA branches and what they would need to do to be able to operate in the UK after Brexit, in terms of understanding and communicating their approaches to the FCA and the PRA in describing sort of the detail of the material outsourcing arrangements that happen at the firm. And I think in terms of the UK's expectations, it's certainly clear that firms have had to be, firms or branches will be responsible for their outsourced functions, and they must be able to monitor the firm's compliance with the obligations. So in terms of the sort of practical challenges to walk through, I think where a branch relies on outsourced functions, and that includes intragroup functions from outside the UK, the branch needs to have clearly mapped that out and be able to demonstrate to their respective regulators how they're robustly managing any of the risks associated with those outsourcing arrangements, including sort of a comprehensive overview of the contingency plans also in place. And I think in terms of those intragroup arrangements, there's some sort of grappling taking place where, and sort of practical observation being, a branch in an EEA branch may actually find itself subject to a different set of arrangements to its head office. Not Anne has touched on on onshoring, and not all of the European requirements will be onshored into sort of the UK regimes. So firms now need to identify what will and won't apply. And the matrix in the paper is very helpful at setting out where that stands now. But obviously that's a snapshot in time, and that will change over time, which again is another practical challenge for firms to be thinking about, or for EEA branches to be thinking about. I think sort of separate to this is the new approach to supervision for these branches, and how that perhaps may align with their home state regulators' expectations in respect of outsourcing arrangements. So there's certainly a sort of a longer term view here in terms of current expectations and how they might change over time.
I think as well, Louise, the point that you make here is really a good one for branches in this situation, because if you are in a position where the branch is essentially trying to lead the change back up to its head office, then that can of course present particular challenges. And this probably leads us nicely onto the topic which has been mentioned already, but I think it's worth coming back to, of intra-group and intra-entity outsourcing more generally. And as we've already said, the spotlight has really been shone on this topic in light of probably the EBA guidelines, and we're seeing ever more focus. So again, PRA is now focusing particularly on intra-entity outsourcings as well. But putting a question to the whole panel, do you think that with these changes coming through, this has required a bit of a mindset change internally and something of a cultural shift? Because certainly from my experience, it seems that intra-group, intra-entity outsourcings, historically at least, may not have been considered in the same way as third-party outsourcings. And therefore, particularly with the EBA guidelines requiring all legacy arrangements to be brought up to compliance by the end of next year, I've seen that presenting particular compliance challenges for people.
I think sometimes it can be difficult even to recognise that you've got an outsourcing arrangement when it's intra-group, if it's been there for quite a long time. People sort of forget that these things exist, and actually this entity here is relying entirely on that entity there to provide some service, because everyone's just used to it. And with computers and email, it doesn't matter that they're far away. They could be in the next room. We have been reviewing a number of our intra-group outsourcing requirements in one of our businesses in particular, and trying to make sure that even though everything seems to be working just fine, that it will continue to work just fine, and actually that there isn't anything that's been missed. I think with a lens of operational resilience, as well as actual strict kind of regulatory compliance, because of the sharp relief that COVID has thrown everyone's operational resilience into. But sometimes just identifying something is there, or there is an outsourcing somewhere, particularly if it's in a part of the business that we don't deal with so much here in London. Even just that can be a little bit of a challenge sometimes, because people don't automatically think, oh yes, this is something that actually we should be looking at through this lens.
Yeah, and I think intra-entity outsourcings present a particular challenge in that respect, because, as you say, very difficult to necessarily identify that there is actually an outsourcing there. And I think operation.
Sorry, Anne.
Sorry.
I'm just saying, I think that another lens that we never really had to give too much thought to in the past is, which is the employing entity of which is the bigger employing entities. And I know in my previous firm, we had a very sort of basic high-level umbrella servicing arrangement across the UK entities, which pre-Brexit, I don't think that our regulators were particularly concerned about, because both of the big entities, that they had control over all of the entities, had access to all of the entities. But then when we got to the point of separating out for operational resilience rules, and we got to the point of working through our Brexit arrangements, actually employing entities started to become much more interesting, and the specificity in the service level agreements that we had became much more important, because suddenly, from an operational resilience perspective, we needed to be able to produce much more meaningful KRIs around KPIs for intergroup management committees and oversight committees. And you've already mentioned it, but I think that the lens then also of the senior managers regime has added another dimension to that fact of, who is it that's providing the service to me? Who do they work for? What is the service? Am I getting what I think I'm getting? And then, I think, and I've had been going through a similar experience to that now in my current firm. But I think also another dimension to it is, the cost challenge that all of us in the industry are under, and what am I? There is a very real commercial driver behind. Am I actually getting the service that I'm being, or am I getting it from a different entity? Am I being charged the wrong? Or is the methodology for how I'm being charged to it compared to how other entities are being charged for it fair? So I think that there is a number of different dimensions on top of the pure inter-entity sourcing piece.
I
think that's right.
Sorry, Anne.
No, sorry, Emily, you go.
I was just going to say, I wanted to pick up on one of the things that Liz mentioned around sort of specificity of SLAs and reporting. We've just had, a fairly minor incident with a third-party outsourcing provider, where it just became apparent that their understanding of a particular area was actually quite different from ours. And it's very easy when you work in financial services to assume that everyone else knows how heavily regulated we are, or how much we've got to report. But of course, someone who is a IT provider, or some sort of outsourced client background checking provider, won't necessarily know exactly what you mean by a particular term or a particular expectation unless you write it down in really granular detail. So that was sort of a practical reminder of how granular and how specific you need to be with your providers.
And that really dovetails back to this point around the PRA sort of closing the field at both ends. So not just the kind of material end, but also that other end of arrangements which might not necessarily meet the definition, but again, they still expect proper levels of governance there. And these sort of IT arrangements are the examples they give. So I think that's a really sort of practical example. And I think the theme that is coming out in these discussions, and I think it's really important to pull out, is operational resilience. It's becoming intertwined with outsourcing. Again, from the PRA perspective, they've made clear that they see it as one of the key tenets of their operational resilience policy. And I think it just means we're seeing an ever-increasing focus on outsourcing. And that's something we saw pre-COVID, and I think COVID, again, has only served to intensify that. And you sort of both talked about the overlap there. And I don't know just whether, again, opening up to the panel, whether there's any further comments on how the two kind of work streams tie together internally, and the sort of practical overlap that you see.
If I think of one document which none of us have mentioned yet, but I think also ties together resilience and outsourcing, is the EBA supervisory expectations on booking models. So the very clear statements that they made around the expectation, plain English, but the mind and management be present in the Brexit entity, and there be outsourcing is possible, but you need to, both from a front office sourcing and a support function servicing arrangement, you need to have the capability in the entity, and you need to have, the risk management and business understanding in the entity. So I think that that's another thing that sort of really crystallised. And I think from as a compliance officer who's worked on a couple of Brexit programs now, that's actually one of the most useful documents to point to in terms of where we need to get to and what we need to have in place to demonstrate where we will have ongoing reliance outside of the Brexit entity.
And I think, I don't really have much to add apart from, I think, increasingly any sensible institution is looking at the two things at the same time in parallel. You can't retrofit, or it is generally more expensive, difficult, frustrating, because you've got to bring along all of these colleagues again to try and retrofit your operational resilience in with your outsourcing compliance. I mean, run the two together, for goodness sake. And I think most people do take that attitude now.
Yeah. And I think sort of pulling all of this together, I think the key themes we've got here are there is more to come. Certainly from a UK perspective, we're expecting more, and that consultation that we've referred to has been delayed, but we will at some point get the final rules from that. And that the focus isn't going away. If anything, it's increasing. So again, I sort of wanted to round off by again going out to all of the panel to see what you see as the key challenges coming up in the next year or so in this space, and what you're particularly looking forward to from a compliance perspective.
I'm not sure what I'm looking forward to. I'll ponder that for a moment. But I think we took a very different approach to our Brexit planning in my previous firm. So we did a cross-border merger. Our Brexit entity went live now about 18 months ago. But we will, in my current firm, we have started some of the operational transfer. We have started some of the client transfer, but from January, making sure that we have our banking and our securities entity fully up and running, that we've got the correct arrangements in place. So at the moment, we're just about done with one of those entities. We are completing our outsourcing review for the other to make sure that everything is, it's a good excuse to fast forward the review of make sure that we're compliant in both of those entities with EBA expectations when we make that transfer, particularly for the securities business. I think also what we are likely to see is more, we've only actually mentioned the pandemic once, I think, in the conversation so far, but I think that this has been one of the best tests of stress scenario and operational resilience that we've ever had. I think that we have fared better than we probably predicted that we would in terms of being able to maintain our operational continuity. We haven't actually triggered our BCP at all, actually. So we watch the situation closely, but managing to work as normally as possible. But we're getting a lot of questions more so on the supervision side rather than the actual the compliance side, I must say, from regulators at the moment. But I think we will see, and again, I'm not sure I will look forward to it, but I think we will see some changes as a result of what regulators have observed through the pandemic. I know that the BIS is already consulting on, it's actually more on the operational resilience side, but they released a consultation in August, actually considering a range of resilience challenges included. So I think that's probably, and I think that's one of the first formal consultations, but I think we will see more along these lines, and more to come post-Brexit as well, as things bed down.
I am doing my best to ignore Brexit most of the time at the moment, but I am quite looking forward to seeing what various regulators have to say about how firms have fared during the pandemic. I think as Liv says, most of us have fared well, better probably than people have expected, whether that's because firms already had pretty decent structures in place, or of course, forced forward certain IT upgrades that would have been done over the next year or two anyway, and that all got brought forward. Including an awful lot more video conferencing to stay in touch with people. But I am interested to see what the regulators have to say about that, whether there are any really practical tips that come out of it as to how we can improve things that will make it easier, I think, to get business buy-in for certain improvements or investments that maybe ideally we would have liked to have seen anyway. But this will, of course, give a bit of external heft to going ahead with them. I'm also quite looking forward to being able to have maybe slightly more constructive conversations with some of my overseas colleagues about outsourcing, just because I will have a bit more awareness of their key concerns now, which don't always mesh with mine. So yeah, hopefully be a bit more constructive and productive going forward on that front as well.
And Louise, coming to you, I believe AFME is considering some further work in this space, including in relation to the paper. So to finish off, I was just wondering if you'd be able to talk us through AFME's predicted work stream in this area and what we might expect.
Sure, certainly. And I would echo points made by Emily and Lith on the EBA and ECB supervisory expectations on the European side, as well as with the UK, FCA, PRA. I think in terms of the future work that we'll be doing here, this was a paper that was very much a snapshot in time. And I think over time, it will be interesting to see where there are new sort of revisions made to existing approaches or expectations. We started off with a relatively small sample area of France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, and Spain. And I think where it would be useful we'd like to perhaps broaden that out to other jurisdictions. The paper is very much, in effect, a living document. So I think it will be updating it with requirements as they change in different jurisdictions, the sort of changing regulatory landscape, new guidelines, new requirements, as I've touched on. And then again, those Brexit considerations. So hoping that this sort of is an opportunity for greater harmonisation. But if, in fact, there are any sticking points, it would be quite useful, I think, to use the paper to identify any diverging views and sort of proceed on that basis.
Thanks, Louise. Yes, and I'd certainly echo that. And I would really like to re-emphasise that we really would encourage you to take a look at the AFME outsourcing paper. It is available on the AFME website. It will also be available on the AFME booth, as well as the Latham & Watkins booth for the conference. So please do take a look. And so all that remains today for me to say is to thank very much my panelists for joining me. So thank you to Emily, Lith and Louise. And to say we hope you found this session useful. Thank you.